All right, welcome everybody to the Gloria Ferrer Masterclass series. I'm here with Brad Kurtz, our vineyard director. My name is Kyle Altamari, the winemaker of Gloria Ferrer here, and we have a fun lineup for you tonight. We're going to be talking about redevelopment strategy and what we do in the vineyard when we're actually going through and planting these blocks. And we're going to talk about aging our library wines. So we've got two fantastic library wines here for you tonight: 2004 Royal Cuvée and 2004 Carneros Cuvée.
So really cool side by side.
Really fun library wines side by side. Brad and I are going to open these right now and suggest you do so if you have some as well. And in the meantime, we're going to get to talking here about how we redevelop the vineyard and what we look for when we're actually going through. You know, this is our 40th harvest this year, 40th anniversary. And, you know, vines tend to get a bit older here in California. So
so when we're talking about redevelopment, I think it's, good to make clear that we're talking about replanting vineyards,
yes,
right? We're
correct.
talking about either, planting a vineyard for whatever reason, pulling out old vines and putting in new vines.
Correct.
So I think probably best to start why we're pulling out those old vines.
Why do we do that?
There's pretty well-known knowledge that old vineyards produce great wines, which is very true. But I think there's a caveat to that. I think that there's, it has to be said that old vineyards that are healthy produce the best wines. So with that being said, we have to look at our vineyards and we have to look at the health of our vineyards. We have to look at the health of our vines. We have to look at the quality of the wines that are coming off of those. We have to look at whether they fit the profile of the wines that we're shooting for. The wines that we want to put out to the consumers, the wines that we're proud of. Are these vineyards still producing wines of that caliber? So that's the most important consideration. There's other considerations. There's financial considerations of, is this block producing enough fruit to pay the bills? Are we spending more to farm these grapes than the value of the grapes themselves? Yields go down, and as the vines get older, definitely when the vines are healthy, those flavors and textures and everything concentrate much more on those old vines. But if they're sick, that's not necessarily the case. So when I'm talking about sick, usually I'm talking about one of two things: wood disease and virus. Those are the two big killers of vineyards. Wood disease meaning pruning, diseases that enter through pruning wounds. They infect the trunks of the vines and make their way down to the roots and eventually kill the vines or severely debilitate the vines to where the growth is really weak and you don't get as high quality of fruit off of them. Virus is a big topic in viticulture right now and has been for the last 15 years or so. Red leaf viruses are the big one right now. So leaf roll and red blotch virus, they can reduce the photosynthetic capacity of vines, which really affects all your metabolites that are produced in the grapes. Everything from sugars to aromatic compounds, everything else can be impacted by that.
Yeah, we see things kind of stall out when we see these in the vineyard.
So the flavor starts going up and then kind of hits a plateau where a lot of times with healthy vineyards, those flavors will keep increasing right up until the day of harvest. So those are kind of the big considerations. Now, it is a big decision to pull out a vineyard. It's something that's a huge investment because when you pull out a vineyard, you may not see fruit off that site for 5, 6, sometimes 7 years, which is you're missing out on a lot, especially if it's on a prime location on the property. We've talked in previous master classes about our soils here and how we have, some really good sites for still wines, some really good sites for sparkling wines, some sites that are kind of in between, some sites that maybe aren't going to give us that reserve level sparkling wine, that Carneros Cuvée and Royal Cuvée, but maybe will give us an acceptable quality for another price tier.
And I think that's a really important place to kind of just pause for a second, because when we're talking about replanting and redeveloping, it's very site specific, right?
Absolutely.
And it's not just a formula. It's not just, hey, this vine is 25 years old. We have a cycle. We have to do this. These sites, block A1, for example. This is one of those ones that's one of the older blocks. I actually think the oldest block on the property.
It's definitely up there. It's probably second or third oldest.
And in terms of, tons per acre, other things like that, might not be there on a spreadsheet, right? But when we taste these wines, it's like, okay, we have to hold on to this as long as we can.
When the finance and accounting teams look at it, they go, why haven't you guys pulled this block out yet? And I say, well, Kyle will kill me if I pull it out.
Because the winemaker said no.
The winemaker said no, because the quality is there, right?
Yes.
it's, an older vine, but they're healthy vines, right?
Yep.
They're producing the canopy. They're a little bit lower yielding, but the quality and the intensity, especially the intensity, the flavor intensity, the aroma intensity,
Yep.
the concentration in those wines that block produces year after year, really,
Yes.
are super intense. So there's caveats to it, right? It has to have the quality for the yields to go down and for the vines to be older and to hang on to them.
Yeah, and there's a balance, right? We obviously have things to take care of, but when we're looking at this, I think the big thing is that we're doing this intentionally for a purpose to raise the quality of our sparkling wines that we make on this site.
And I think the other thing to talk about too is rootstock and clone.
Yes.
So just because a vineyard's older doesn't mean it was planted on the right rootstock. It wasn't planted necessarily to the right clone for that site or for the goals of the winemaking team. So we look at something like, let's say, D1.
Yep.
D1 was a block that we recently pulled out. It was a clone that was the site is more of a sparkling wine site. The clone that was planted there was a still wine, red wine, Pinot Noir clone. The rootstock was kind of a devigorating rootstock on a low vigor site. So the vines were very weak. The fruit was not the quality we're looking for from that site. And the tonnage was low. So we made the decision, these aren't the right vines. This isn't the right combination of clone and rootstock for this site. This site is a sparkling wine site, not a red wine site. This is something where we need a little bit of more of a high vigor rootstock than a low devigorating rootstock to balance out the growth and the yields on this site. And so we decided to pull that out, and it's sitting fallow now, and we're waiting to replant it. So,
Doing some soil amendments.
Yep, exactly.
So I think
the soil rest.
walk me through we've talked about why do we replant. When we actually decide to replant, what are the steps that we take?
Yeah, so like I said, it can be upwards of a 6 to 7 year process sometimes, depending on the site. So first step, obviously, is remove the vineyard. That can either be done in the spring or the fall, depending on how you want to go about it. Sometimes people pull the vineyards out right after harvest, so you get one more harvest off of it, and then you pull it out. We typically harvest in mid to end of August,
yeah.
So there's plenty of time to pull that vineyard out after harvest, or you pull it out the next spring. Either way, you're pulling it out. Then you have to dispose of all the vines, dispose of the trellis. So the classic way is to burn them. So you pile up all the vines, you burn them. We've done a lot of wood chipping lately. So we'll chip the vines and use them in the compost, or we'll use them we'll spread them out in the field and disc them into the soil to get all that organic matter back into the soil.
Yep.
We've done biochar recently. We burn them to create biochar, which is stable carbon that we can then incorporate back into the soil. So there's lots of options. Usually the steel is recycled. We bring it to a local metal foundry, and they'll recycle that metal, that steel, from all the end posts and the stakes and the wires and things like that. From there, we'll plant a cover crop. So we'll seed in a cover crop, and we'll do what's called fallowing the field. So the field will sit empty, essentially. We'll have the cover crop. That cover crop will get mowed, and it'll grow for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, depending on how we feel the health of the site. If it has soil pest problems, so like something like phylloxera or nematode issues, we might let it rest for extra years to help bring down the populations of those soil pests. And then after that, we'll start re-amending the soils. So I'm a big soil nerd, so I spend a lot of time in soil pits out in the vineyards. So what we'll do is for every 3 to 5 acres, I'll dig a soil pit. If it's a 10-acre vineyard, I might dig 4, maybe 5 even soil pits for that vineyard, and we'll get in there and I'll really do a full analysis of each one of those soil pits. Even though these vineyards look fairly flat and uniform, we've learned by experience
You can see it as you're
they're
going through.
not uniform at all.
Not even close.
Making sure that we understand the minute differences between different soils. A change of 2 to 3% clay can make a huge difference in the health and vigor of those vines and how you need to amend those soils. So, you have 4% more rock in this section of the vineyard, you might need to amend those soils differently. So it's important to really understand what you have, take samples, dig soil pits, Don't look at the surface of the soil. It's always deceiving. So what looks like really good soil above may not be as good below. What might look like really
Bad soil,
above might be the best soil below. So you have to really dig those soil pits and see. There's no way around it. Get the backhoe out there and dig the soil pits. So amending soils, we use a ton of different things to amend soils. The main ones are gypsum. Gypsum is calcium sulfate. Calcium is something that is really helpful. We have higher magnesium soils here. So calcium really helps balance out the magnesium in the soil. Magnesium can cause some toxicity. It can bind up some nutrients in the soil. So to balance it out with calcium is really important. Calcium also helps soil structure. So we have some really hard clays here. It can help break up those clays and make them less difficult to work the roots through. So when we plant the vines, the roots can push through.
Give them a little bit more air,
It makes
a little more
it
space
fluffier,
to move.
makes the soil fluffier, a little fluffier. These are all organic, obviously organic inputs, organic approved inputs. Biochar is the other one. I talked a little bit about creating biochar with the vines. It's something that I'm exploring more and more, and I'm really liking what I'm seeing. I think biochar is something that, think of it as, after you finish your campfire, that black charcoal that's left in there, that is stable carbon. So that will last in your soil for upwards of thousands of years. So it's not something that you need to keep reapplying. You do it once, and if you get enough out there, you can kind of call it one and done, one application and done. The best time to do that is when there's no vines in the ground and you can incorporate it deep in the soils. And that really helps with water holding capacity. It helps with lowering the bulk density of the soil. So like I said, not making that soil, those clay soils can get really hard. Think about a brick of clay when it dries. It's like rock solid. It can help break that up, give the roots a path to move through the soil easier.
It changes the architecture of what's going on below the surface, right?
And it's like a sponge, right? It holds onto water, holds onto nutrients. It makes it supercharges those soils.
It's got a nice, all those, if you look at it on my script, lots of little pits in
Tons
there.
of pores for...
Great place for microfauna, microflora, bacteria, all the stuff that we need to create healthy soils, right?
I'm a huge fan of biochar. It's something that the longer I use it, the more I use it, the more I really think it's necessary for the redevelopment, especially on these sites. And the last is good old-fashioned compost. Compost has a fairly complete nutrient profile for our vines. So when we put those young vines in the ground, we want them to have tons of nutrients so they can really take off and start growing. They can push their roots deep, tap down. Those first year or two is critical for building root architecture. So we really want to make sure those young vines we put in the ground have the best chance possible to survive and to thrive. So having the compost in there has the carbon. It helps build the soil microbes up. It really helps with nutrition as well. So we put all those out. We spread them right over the top of the field. And then what we do is we do a lot of deep ripping. So deep ripping is when we take typically a dozer, a big dozer, a D6 or D8 cat dozer.
Big ones.
Big guys, My son loves them.
Things the ones that the kids come out and they're like, I want to get on that track.
Exactly, and also me. The big kids too.
The big kids like it too.
But they have these big 4-foot long ripping shanks. So they're 4-foot long shanks that come off these tractors. They sink them deep into the soil and it fractures that soil about 4 to 5 feet down. And it'll actually help mix in some of those amendments deeper into the soil profile than if you were to just disc them in to the top 6 inches. We really want to get those amendments down deep. We want to fracture any compaction, break any compaction in the soil. These vineyards have been here for 30 plus years. So, some of these vineyards, you've been driving tractors over them for 30 plus years, the soils can get pretty compacted. And so breaking up those top 4 to 5 feet is really helpful.
To drive roots straight
It's all
down,
about with those young vines, fluffing up that soil a little bit, making it nice, just like a garden bed, right? We want to put those vines in and we want them to be able to put roots straight down as deep as possible.
Not be lazy and have, 6
Not
inches
get a
that they go
compacted layer and then they go
out.
horizontally out. We want them to go tap down deep so they're resilient. They can tap into deeper water. We don't have to rely on irrigation as much. They're more resilient in heat waves, things like that. So it's really important to break up the compaction by deep ripping.
And create healthier soil.
And create the healthier soil. So we'll flatten out the soil a little bit. We'll disc it a few times. We'll have to lay out the vineyard. So easier than it's more
easier said than done.
Yeah, more difficult than it sounds. Easier said than done. But you have to basically take all the existing lines, line up exactly with those ones, make sure every row is square to the next row.
Yep.
Make sure if you're doing 8-foot rows, every row is 8 feet apart. If you're 1 inch off, you might be 3 to 4 feet off by the last row.
Correct.
And so every vine is exactly 5 feet apart or 6 feet apart.
Yep.
So it's a critical stage, and it's measure twice, put in stakes once.
Put roots in the ground once.
Yeah, exactly.
Don't move them.
You don't want to have crooked rows when you're planting vineyards 20 years down the line.
No.
So it's critical to get those layouts done right. Then we'll put stakes in the ground, get end posts in, start putting wires in, irrigation in, all that critical stuff. And then the fun part comes. We get to put vines in the ground.
Yep. So when we're doing this, okay, we've gone over the physical of what do we do when we're getting it ready? How do we actually physically get the soil and the parcel ready? Mm-hmm. But when we're looking at this, we talked last time about we're very fortunate to have our own set of clones that we work with here on the property. We touched briefly on what a clone is and how it works here at the site. When we're looking at this, what are the attributes that we've kind of tended to lean into as we're starting to redevelop this property?
Yeah, so as we move towards organic farming, I think it's important that we're looking at viticulture a little differently, right?
Yep.
We're trying to lower inputs, lower our water usage especially. Every time you turn on the irrigation, you're irrigating vines, but you're also irrigating weeds.
Yep.
And we don't have herbicides to rely on anymore. Our weed control comes in the form of a shovel.
Yep.
So that's a lot more labor intensive.
A lot of hands touch that.
And so it's important to control weeds by controlling irrigation. It's important to understand that our fertility program now is based on compost,
which is slower to release, right?
Slower to release. You don't get those big shots. It's not jet fuel for the vines, It's not like putting.
It's not like your kid after Halloween where you just jack them up on candy.
Yeah, exactly. So it's important to understand that the soils we have may not be the most fertile soil, right? So we need to pick rootstocks that impart more vigor onto our vines.
Yep.
That tap down deeper into the soil. We can put on fewer irrigations. When we rip the soil, we put that rootstock in, and those roots go straight down to the water.
Yep.
And they're able to tap into that. They're able to spread their roots across a bigger area to mine. I'm using word like mine,
Sure.
but they're really finding
to
the
seek
nutrients,
out
seek out those nutrients in the soil, and they're not just relying on a drip, like they're not a baby on a bottle, getting their nutrients and water from a dripper. They're getting it from their environment.
Yep.
So they're spreading out more. They're more aggressive. They come up. I would rather hedge back vineyards and irrigate less than I would try to nurse a vine back to health and try and
Dump
force
the
it to
water
grow.
on. Yeah.
Have to turn tons of water, put tons more compost on to try and convince it to grow, versus one that just wants to grow and I have to devigorate it by leaving cover crop.
You have to rein it back in.
We can. There's tons of tools we have to devigorate it that are much easier than the tools we need to reinvigorate vines. If I just don't mow the cover crop, all that cover crop is going to compete with the vines and help devigorate them naturally.
Sure.
That's easy. That costs me no money. That costs
It's a lot easier too. You don't have to shovel the weeds.
For my crew, they don't have to go out there.
Yeah.
We leave that cover crop tall. Those vines have tons of competition and they won't grow as aggressively.
Yep.
So it's a lot easier to devigorate the vines than it is to invigorate the vines.
Yep.
So I've been choosing rootstocks that are higher vigor. These sites have also been farmed continuously for 40 years. These aren't, this isn't fresh land. This isn't land that's, just became vineyard and has tons of nutrient resources in it. It's land that's had tractors been driving on it for 40 years.
And pulling out nutrients.
They've been pulling out nutrients for 40 years. So we need to be able to tap deeper into the soils and start building those soils back through those amendments we're putting on.
Yep.
So all those things are important. And like I said, I would rather be able to devigorate those vines. So we pick a rootstock that's very strong, that can really grow quickly and can really thrive in the environment that it's in. And so what we'll do is, after we have those stakes in the ground, we'll plant the rootstock. So typically there's two options. You could plant bench grafted vines, which have the rootstock and the budwood, we call it scion wood, already pre-grafted on there. And you can plant those, or you can plant rootstocks and you can graft them later in the field. Typically, I prefer to plant rootstock and graft it in the field, but we do both methods. So when we plant rootstock out in the field, it's usually dormant. So they pull the rootstock out of the ground in the winter. They plant it in the spring of the previous year. They pull it out in the winter, and it's literally just bare roots and a stick growing out of the ground.
Big old ball of root.
Big old ball of roots, bare rooted, and we'll trim up the roots and we'll put it in the ground. And in the spring, as they warm up, they'll start to grow. We'll let them grow for 6 months typically, and then we'll graft them over. Sometimes we let them grow a full year and graft them the next spring.
Okay.
It just depends on the situation.
Yep.
So after they've been planted, it's typically 2 to 3 years before you even get the opportunity to get what I call a cheater crop, right?
Yep.
That cheater crop's like your 2 ton per acre crop. It's usually lower quality.
Quality's not there.
Quality's not there. Sometimes we use it if we really need the fruit. Sometimes we do not.
What's better? What's better for the health of the vineyard?
Typically, I would say dropping that fruit while it's still green before it starts accumulating sugar. All those sugars can go down into the roots instead and help that vine grow and help put deeper roots down. That being said, I don't think it has a massive difference. The quality, you're not getting that much tonnage. The quality's fine. It's never going to make Carneros Cuvée, but it is usable fruit. So I'd say it's about 50-50. Sometimes we use it, sometimes we don't. It also depends on what we're seeing out in the field, right? So we'll go out, we'll look at it. Does it look like it's worth picking? Sometimes the quality is a little better than you expected. Sometimes it's a little worse. So you have to make sometimes a game time decision.
And from a winemaking perspective, sometimes it's kind of, you have to really take it as a year by year and a vintage by vintage thing, because sometimes you can get out there like we did with C5 and C, or C2 and C3 this year. It was kind of like, wow, this actually might work. So it was kind of a preview or a prelim to what we're gonna get next year.
It's like
it's coming to full production.
Coming to theaters soon, you know.
Exactly.
Your sneak preview.
And then just to think about, how are we gonna use this? What are we gonna do? Where does this wine want to end up? So having that little bit of a cheater year, but also just to keep eyes on it before we bring it into the winery for commercial production.
See, hey, maybe we could use this for a certain part of the blend. Maybe we could use this for color. Maybe it's a still wine. Maybe it wants to be still wine. You never know.
All of these things that you have, you get an extra period to evaluate, right? So now that we've talked about really how we redevelop, I think it's important to kind of touch back on grading in the winemaking side to say, okay, we're redeveloping these vineyards for what purpose, right? And when we get into the grading, just a quick review of grading, it's when we get to those wines that are producing low B, high C grade wines, that's kind of our first indication as a team to go out and say, what's going on?
And sometimes it's a vintage, sometimes it's one vintage, right?
Exactly.
We have a weird vintage, there's a heat wave, it's a drought year, it's a wet year maybe.
Yep.
And the quality of the fruit from that particular combination of site, clone, and rootstock just didn't work.
Correct.
But it's when it's repeated vintages.
We're looking at the trend line, right? If this vineyard block year over year continues to kind of, last year it was borderline B, and this year it's a borderline B minus, and now we're in the fermenter and it's kind of tasting more like a C plus. That's our indication of, okay, we need to get out and figure out, does it need more amendments? Like, is this something we can salvage? Do we need to do vine surgery? Is there too much out there that has some wood disease that your team needs to go out and fix? Do we need to take care of pests differently? Or is it just time for this vineyard to be redeveloped and replanted into something that's a bit more indicative of what we need right now?
Yeah, and maybe more appropriate for the site.
Yes, and maybe we're looking at something with different rootstock, or maybe we're looking at a different clone, or even a different varietal in that spot.
Absolutely.
Right? As the winemaking and style evolves, the vineyard has to continue to support that, especially being that all of our sparkling wines are here from this property, right? This is what we have to work with. And if a wine isn't showcasing the best of this property, I think that's our clear indication of it's time to go, right? So that's the real reason for doing these grading tastings, is that when we sit down and we start to try and look at making these blends, especially like the two wines we're drinking now, we're drinking wines that are 20 years old. And they're still tasting fresh. These are some of our
This 04 Royal
extended.
is
It's
just my absolute favorite.
This is a phenomenal
This is
wine.
one of the best library wines, and we'll dive into these a
we'll
little
get
later,
into
but
them, but I mean, but this is
I've just been sipping on it. I'm like almost finished my glass because I can't stop.
It's
so good.
evolved so much even just since we opened it.
know.
And when we're talking about what quality we're trying to strive to produce, it's to lay things down for 20 years like this and have it continue to get better.
And the grading tasting is kind of twofold, right? It helps you put together those blends.
Yes.
But it's also the report card for the vineyard for that vintage.
It's when you get the report card, it's also how do we make sure that only the components that need to be there are there, because blending is you can get into a rabbit. You've seen these blending sessions that I go to, and sometimes I have to get up and walk away from the table because I'm like, I've gone too far down a rabbit hole. We're not even where we started, and this isn't where I'm tending to go. And the more components that you get on the table, the harder it is oftentimes to balance all of those things. So the grading is the report card for the vintage, but it's also when we sit down at the blending table, making sure that only the components that are going to be worthy of making it into Royal Cuvée or Carneros Cuvée are there when we're doing those blending sessions. Because when we're talking about this and we're talking about wines that we know we're going to intentionally lay down as library wines, we have what's this on program, right? 5 years for Royal and 7 to 8 for Carneros. And then we have our extended tirage, and we'll get into that more. But when we're making these blends, it's really derived from the fact that you have to have high quality fruit. These are A-grade wines only on the table when we're making these blends. But you need fruit that works together harmoniously, and you need to strike a balance, right? And it's really hard to think about 7 years down the road with Carneros Cuvée, what's going to be going on? What is the flavor profile going to be of this, not only this wine, but what are people going to want out of this wine, right? So, but the thing that I think that always strikes through is if you have the right components on the table, you're going to make a high quality wine. And I think the most important aspect to blending wines here at Gloria Ferrer is texture.
Yes.
We know these aromatics are going to change. We know, and we talked about last time, how varietals differ as they age and why we use Pinot Noir and what we use it for and why we use Chardonnay and what we use it for. Chardonnay to add that length and elegance and structure, and Pinot Noir to add that spice and the complexity characteristic and the vintage-driven wines, if you will. I mean, all of these wines that we make for these reserve tiers are vintage-driven, so we need to showcase that. But it's really about texture. And I think that's really where the health of the vineyard shows through. Because again, as wines are young, all wines when they're in the fermenters, and you've gone through fermenter tastings with as well, they're awesome. They're like, I want to bottle this right now and capture it, and that's it. That's what I want. But those aromatics, those things that are kind of flashy, they tend to degrade.
The guava,
yes,
the
it's
lemon,
the fermentation esters, and it's hitting you, and you're like, oh,
whoa, this is crazy. I've never had a sparkling wine like this, because they're not going to actually be
exactly
there in the sparkling wine.
Exactly. And then you get to blending, and you're like, where'd it go? Yeah. So those high-toned esters, the terpenes, right? These things that are very fragile in terms of the structure of their actual chemical composition, they tend to degrade. But what doesn't degrade is how the wine feels. If a wine's got astringency and a little bit of bitterness because the vineyard wasn't healthy, or we didn't do our job,
or it's thin and missing mid-palate, or it has a short finish,
dilute, right? It tastes more like drinking water than it does drinking, wine. Then we've kind of got to look at that, and that's something that's not going to end up on the table when we're making these library wines that are destined for our high-end programs, our best tête de cuvée, and stuff that's going to lay down for a while. So we also have to look at, when is this wine going to be released? Is there something that can resolve itself with time as we lay these wines down? So Carneros Cuvée, when you put it in bottle, can kind of be a bit edgy, right? You taste it 1 year after, and you're like, oh, we still got some time. But you have to,
that time will be there.
Exactly. You have to look ahead and go, okay, is this something that will resolve with time, or is it a problem? So I think that's where the real craft comes in, is taking a number of different base wines, all with their own great, because these are all A-grade wines when we do this, they all have their own great personalities. How do you make them work together? And we have different percentages that we can do. We have different fermentation vessels, as you know, we've been messing around with. But are we blending a wine that needs to be early to release, like Brut Rosé? And we need to make sure that we're using those aromatic components? Or is this going to go into Royal Cuvée Rosé that's going to sit for a little bit longer? Or is it going to go into Carneros Cuvée Rosé that's going to sit even longer? Yeah. So I think the number one thing you have to, with sparkling wine, when you're putting together these wines and when you're coming up with even the new innovation SKUs that we do, how long is it going to age for is what you have to ask yourself.
That's a big question.
First, right? You have to work backwards almost. And it was one of the hardest things when I was learning to make sparkling wine was in still wine, you have this idea, you go in and you're like, I'm going to make this style, and you march forward, right?
Yeah.
And sparkling wine, you almost have to go, where do I want to...
when you're putting that blend together, that's what it's going to taste like when you release the wine.
Exactly. Yeah. But with sparkling wine, it's kind of, where do I want to go? Mm-hmm. Okay, how do I work backwards from there? So making wines, but again, I think that's where the textural component, and it's something that I've always loved about the wines that we produce here at Gloria Ferrer, is the wines are so texture driven. They're lively when they're young. You've seen them when we pour them in the glass and we get that really nice bubble stacking.
I mean, look at this 2003 Carneros Cuvée
it's still there.
Looks like a hot tub going.
It's still going, right?
It's crazy.
A 20-year-old wine with a chimney of bubbles still just going.
I mean, we poured those 20 minutes ago or more.
And again, just wines that age gracefully, right? That get better as we put them down. This is also why we only do méthode traditionnelle.
Yes.
Right. This wine.
You don't get these characteristics from
no other production method. Yeah. These wines were put into each of these bottles 20 years ago, right? And think about, what were you doing 20 years ago?
Yeah.
It's a tough question, right? So again, it's kind of a humbling thing to sit there at the blending table and say, and it goes all the way back to you have to even start this when we go into the vineyard, right? And this is what we're starting to do, is look at this full circle and say, we know where we want to go. We know how to get there. These are the things that we have to do. It starts with organic farming.
To take,
yeah, it starts with everything that you do in the vineyard. It transitions to everything we do in the winery. And it shows when you put a wine in the glass that 20 years later, people are still going, wow, that's something cool.
Yeah, I mean, we had a winemaker's dinner, what was that? Maybe
a couple weeks
ago. And we poured this 04 Royal Cuvée, and I was just like, I've had quite a few library wines from Gloria Ferrer, some very old wines, going back into the 80s and 90s. And this one really stood out to me. I mean, this is one that's texture-wise, some of those older vintages are a little edgier, maybe a little bit of astringency, maybe they're a little flatter. This one has so much concentration. So much length, and it's just so impressive. It's a testament to the fruit. I mean, it's still got that characteristics of the fruit.
Yep.
Obviously, it's got immense aged tertiary qualities from the yeast and from the aging time in bottle. But it's just unbelievable how much purity of fruit is still there and how fresh this wine is.
Yeah, and I really think
20 years later.
I think that's the real signature style for Gloria Ferrer, right? Is it's purity of fruit off the estate, and it's layers of complexity and depth, right? This is a seamless wine from front to back, and it only goes with getting the right components on the table when you're putting it there. And then again, once we pop the cork or crown cap in this case, making sure that you're dosing it right and dosing it with intentionality, and not just saying, well, what could we put in there that's the normal standard Royal Cuvée dosage is always Royal Cuvée dosage. It doesn't work like that.
Matching the wine.
It's tasting the base wine and looking at it and how it's evolved, because I'll be honest, a lot of times I take these wines and I'm like, oh, I think it'll go there. And then, down the road, you're like, ooh, that was different, but it's always in a positive manner. So I think that's the importance of dosing with intentionality. And physically, when we talk about these têtes de cuvée and icon wines here that we create, we actually physically use different materials when we're producing these wines. And that's the biggest thing. Each one of these crown caps, when we lay it down in tirage, you got to think, if we produce, let's say, for just bold math, you have 15,000 bottles to produce. Well, that's 15,000 individual fermentations that are going to happen, which means 15,000
tanks or barrels.
Exactly. So we take it from one big blend and put it down into 15,000 individual fermentations, which are all going to be conducted differently. Was it on the top stack in the tirage stack, or was the temperature
degree different,
or was the center bottle, was it the top bottle or the bottom left or the center, as they're all cumulatively creating heat, and you're trying to manage this? All of these logistic things make a difference. And what we actually have to do,
things that keep you up at night.
Oh, big time. It's like, for months. I just won't sleep when we're doing these wines. And actually, it was funny. The first time I ever did Tirage, I didn't sleep for like a month and a half because I was checking pressure every day, and it was almost like too much information. But and so again, thinking
You
backwards,
almost have to have faith. They've been doing it like this for hundreds of years. It's going to be okay.
That's it. And that's what, it was actually funny because the first thing somebody ever told me about sparkling wine was trust the math. And I was like, okay, if the math is good, then we're good. Because the last thing you want to do as a sparkling winemaker is put something down to Tirage and a week later come in and hear a bunch of little pop, 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 pop. Just close the door and go home at that point, right?
Yeah, no, that's a nightmare.
So when we're doing these library wines and these tête de cuvée wines, we actually physically use different materials than when we're producing.
So you're talking about
something.
the crown caps.
Yeah, the crown caps.
First of all, what is a crown cap?
So and if you look at a champagne bottle, it's completely different than a still wine bottle, right? It's
different
more
than a Burgundy bottle, different than a Bordeaux bottle.
Exactly.
Thicker glass, of course.
It has to, right? We have to hold the pressure. But we actually have, it's more like a beer top where we can actually put a physical crown cap over it. The benefit of that is with crown caps, you have something that is, inert, so it doesn't actually exchange anything chemically with the wine, which is very good because when you're laying it down with a specific thought and a specific purpose. It also allows you to change what's called the OTR, the oxygen transfer rate, of how much oxygen is actually let through that cap and is there to interact with the wine. And we do this in a milligrams per liter per month type calculation, right? But when you have to think about laying something down for 7 years with Carneros Cuvée,
or 20 years
for
extended Tirage.
Exactly. When you're talking about the difference of a half a milligram per liter per month, doesn't sound like a lot. But when you add up the fact that we have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of months, the cumulative amount of oxygen that you get in there is completely different. Yeah. So I think when you're making these wines, it starts with making wines that are lower pH. And these are ones that are I will always try and drive the pH down on things like Carneros Cuvée and Royal Cuvée. If we can be right at about that 3 mark on pH.
Choosing the blending components that naturally have that
higher acidity,
lower pH. Acidity,
Yep, because pH is a huge factor when you're consuming oxygen. So we've got a couple of things to protect us when we talk about these older wines and when we talk about aging under cork versus entourage. We've got the physical crown cap that we put on that has a different liner, and that liner in there we get to actually choose. And we specifically select liners that have the designated amount of oxygen transfer that we want. We know they're going to hold a seal. We know they're completely inert. So it starts with the physical cap, and we control it that way. But we also control it by controlling chemistry of the blends. We have a little bit of sulfur in there to actually buffer a little bit of the initial oxygen. And there's what's called an initial oxygen transfer rate because you have a huge bottle filled with nothing but air. And you can't do things like inert gas them or anything like that, but with still wine, that's awesome. You want to minimize the amount of oxygen. With sparkling wine, you don't want to because you can actually delay the onset of fermentation because you've got to re-ferment the bottle. Yeah. If you put it in from a tank that's got ample amounts of oxygen and the yeast are very happy.
All the oxygen out of a barrel or out of a fermentation.
Think about
tank.
If you were running a marathon and at mile marker 8, someone just put you in a room with no oxygen and said, run the rest of this marathon on a treadmill.
Bag over your
you
head.
wouldn't be very happy, right?
Yeah.
The yeast don't want it either. So we don't actually use inert gas to sparge those bottles because we want that oxygen. So there's an initial transfer rate of oxygen, which is very, very big, helps the yeast, but then there's a controlled amount of oxygen transfer after that. That's the physical side. From the chemistry side, we drive the pH down. And then we've got the other thing. Are we going to age this wine under cork as just a library release, or are we going to age it as a extended Tirage wine where we actually leave these on the crown cap with the yeast in the bottle for upwards of 20 years in the case of this, with these 04s. And again, it's very important to differentiate the two because while we have that crown cap that's a measured amount of oxygen, we also have the yeast. So the yeast are very, very good at consuming all the oxygen that is let through in a very meticulous manner. It's not to say that they will consume every milligram of oxygen that comes in there, but they will react differently than if you don't have them in there. So when you look at these, you have to look at this and say, again, you talked about how fresh these wines were, how these wines were sitting in Tirage because that yeast is really what showcases. It adds a little bit of flavor complexity. It adds some differentiating components there that are more tertiary, like you had said, but it protects your fruit structure there. So while we get, it's more akin to micro oxygenation rather than macro oxygenation. And if you put it under cork, you have now started the time clock on a different manner.
You don't have that yeast in there to protect the wine.
Exactly. The amount of factors that you have to protect you are much different. And again, the goal is to create wines that we can put on a normal program under cork and they taste amazing. And then under tirage, you get a completely different and completely...
And so that's kind of the basis of our two different, library programs. We have the extended tirage library program.
Yes.
So you have wines that might be disgorged 20 years later. And then we have our cork aged library program where we have, like for Carneros Cuvée, let's say, it's aged for 8 years in tirage and then it's disgorged with all the other, the majority, I should say, not all the other, but the majority of the Carneros Cuvée from that vintage. You put a cork in it. It doesn't have yeast in it there anymore. It's been disgorged. You put a cork in it and it ages on the cork. We call it on the cork or cork age. And that will age for another 12 years or 10 years. Or
it doesn't even release until it's got 1 year under cork.
Yeah,
right?
So that's the normal Carneros.
Correct.
So the library, the cork aged library wines, those ones can get longer time as well.
Longer.
And so it's very interesting to taste the difference between those cork aged library wines and the extended tirage because the wines are the same age. They're just been aged under very different conditions. One under the crown cap with the yeast still in the bottle, and one under cork with no yeast in the bottle. And the difference is dramatic. And
it's so cool because you can create different styles of wine, like you said, with the same wine. And it's what really drew me to making sparkling wine as well, is you get so many more touch points, not only in the vineyard because we do that, but in the production process as well. There's so many more different levers that you can pull to really craft a wine that is indicative of what you're trying to showcase, right? And in this case, with the wines that we produce at Gloria Ferrer, it's that purity of fruit, texture-driven wines that are all about the site. It's all about this place, and that's really what we get into. So I think at this point we should probably start. I know you've already gotten through that Royal Cuvée,
I've been diving into that Royal Cuvée, man. I'm really liking that wine. The Carneros Cuvée, which shockingly, these wines have had very similar aging conditions. Speaking, we just talked about, the same wine aged two different ways. This is two different wines aged the same way. And it shows how different the base wine, how different that the wine that you put into the bottle initially can affect that aging process. Because these wines are completely different. The Carneros Cuvée is typically around 55% Pinot Noir, 45% Chardonnay.
About that.
And the Royal Cuvée is typically about 2/3 Pinot Noir, 1/3 Chardonnay. And the difference in these wines is really dramatic. The Carneros Cuvée is so much more, in my opinion, aged character. It's got that creaminess. It's got that nuttiness. It's got that brioche. It's almost, it's almost savory. Where it's got those savory characters to it, almost like toasted coconut kind of flavor profile going on, which, not that the Royal doesn't have that, but it's way more intense in this wine.
Whereas the Royal is really about the fruit and the purity of fruit, Carneros Cuvée is really about, again, the texture and those aged characters. And that's it from when we release what's called on program, right? Wines that are released when they are designated as we have thought about them in terms of style. And it showcases all the way when it goes through wines that are in extended tirage like these wines are. It's really about the differentiating factor being those blocks of Pinot Noir that we use. Right? And the blocks of Chardonnay.
Which blocks are used,
Correct.
What dosage you use.
So,
that's a decision. These wines were put down 20 years ago, but you as the winemaker today get to make the decision on what dosage to use. So when we disgorge them, we lose a little bit of wine, and it's what, 2, 3, 4% maybe?
It's anywhere from 2 to 4%
of the total volume of the wine. But you get to pick what wine you put back in there to replace that, as well as the amount of sugar you put back in to replace that. So that's kind of your fingerprint that you get to put on these wines, after their 20-year production life.
It's something that you really, when you're dealing with a wine that is this complex, you really have to be careful when you're doing a dosage selection. And these are the ones that I will often go, and we may blend two different dosages together. We may blend
You'll
three.
do an old one and a young
Yes.
one, or a more Chardonnay and some Pinot.
Yes.
And get a blended dosage.
It's really about tasting the wine before you think about where the dosage wants to go, and then tailoring that dosage to these wines. Because again, the last thing you want to do with dosage, you can, with that 2%, you can add so much, or you can sit right on top of it and subdue a whole lot of very good things.
Yes.
So it's really about just trying to create a wine that showcases exactly what was going on with that specific wine.
Yeah, just going back and forth between these two wines, it's really incredible in how much they are stylistically contrasting with two wines that are similar blends, that are off the same estate, that are really dramatically different. They've been aged the same amount of time in the same way, and they're just dramatically different. And
if you would pour them blind, you wouldn't even think these were the same year. That's how different these are.
No, not at all. I would be very surprised to learn that these are the same vintage.
Yeah.
And that they're aged the same way. But
yeah,
let's get to some questions. Oh, we got a long one.
Perfect. Still wines have a drink between date associated with them. Example, Cabernet Sauvignon, and can reach peak many years away. Start slow degradation, layer as it sits. Is this true with sparkling wines? Does sparkling wine lose its effects, or do they, for example, age like a still wine? This is a very, very complex question because, again, it's determined by not only the production method but the producer and so many things.
And also personal preference.
And personal preference. That is the best point. So I will say that here at Gloria Ferrer, we do the aging for you. Trust me, we love it. We want you to drink it. I promise if you drink it, we'll make more of it, right?
Yes.
But that being said, if you do want to lay it down, think of it this way. If you like wines that are more fruit driven, even if you're buying older wines, there's going to be more fruit than when you let it age under cork. So the longer time it ages under cork, the less fruit notes you're going to have, the more secondary characteristics. Pinot Noir tends to get spicy. Chardonnay gets a little bit more preserved, right? That preserved lemon, things like that.
The more oxidized aldehydic type characters. It's all personal preference.
It's personal preference, and I will say that age range on sparkling wine tends to be a lot longer than it is on still wine because you have a lot of different things protecting you even under cork that still wines don't have.
And if I would also put in there, if you are going to age sparkling wine, you would want to age it, my understanding is you would want to age it vertically, or age the bottle vertically.
You can age the bottle vertically. That is not a problem. We have pressure in there.
Yeah.
CO2. We have a number of things protecting us. We have a low pH, which we just mentioned earlier, consumes a lot less oxygen. So that effect of oxidation is much slower, even under cork, than it is for still wines. But we've also got a very, very high level of CO2, roughly 10 times as much at the very minimum to be created to call it a sparkling wine than the highest level than you can have for a still wine. Yeah. So that CO2 helps buffer out any oxidation as well.
But I would say stick a bottle of sparkling wines, buy a bottle of Gloria Ferrer, maybe a nice bottle, stick it in the back of your wine fridge, age it for 5, 10, 15 years, see what you think. I mean, it's something that we definitely do at the winery. You can come into our come to our library tasting.
I would do the reserve experience with our extended Tirage wines is definitely something that I would do. If you're just getting into trying to learn about aged sparkling wines, our team does a fantastic job of putting this all together for you. And I think you should go buy a lottery ticket because the next question is, how should sparkling wines be stored? Should they be laying flat on their side or standing up? So he's on the same wavelength here. So yeah, you should definitely store them standing up. The whole thing used to be to lay them on their side so the cork doesn't dry out. Nowadays, we have so much technology and we have so many production methods, and our quality control here at Gloria is so high that you are not in risk of any of those corks drying out and becoming what are called peg corks, where they get very, very thin and flat and they actually lose their elasticity.
Yeah.
That is not as much of a risk as it was historically anymore, as well as you have, again, pressure that's created from the bubbles that we have in there that are going to keep your wine safe.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm going to enjoy the rest of my glass. And we want to say thank you guys for joining us, and we'll see you at the next masterclass. Cheers.